Yeah.
That's hello in Greek. It's Mr. Benke again. This is Classical Civilization in the Mediterranean, Chapter 4 in our Stearns book. This might be something that you're all a little bit more familiar with, so I don't have to spend a whole lot of extra time on this. Plus, I have some cool stories that I want to talk about in class. So to keep this in the 15-minute limit, I'm going to get moving here. We start talking with Greece because they're the beginning of classical civilization in the Mediterranean. This is where they fall on the timeline. You can see we've got the Maurya, the Gupta dynasties here, China with the Qin, the Zhou, the Qin, the Han, um, and Greece falls right in here. Now this is a video. I'm going to skip this, go to my website, and watch the video there. But the story starts with the Minoan civilization, which was wiped out. We're not really sure why. It was probably a natural disaster, volcanic eruption, which is pretty cool. I'll talk about that in class. You already know something about this if you know anything about the Minotaur, which is the half man, half bull creature that the Athenians had to sacrifice their young people to. I'm going to skip that. So, a gigantic volcanic eruption probably is what wiped out the Minoans. Uh, you do know something about the Mycenaean civilization because that's where the famed Trojan horse happens. The Trojan War was the Mycenaeans fighting against the city-state of Troy. This is something else I'll be talking about in class. This video here I'm going to skip as well. It's a funny wife swap about the Athenians and the Spartans. Skip. Oh, that's the Trojan War. I'm sorry, not wife swap yet. Okay. So what we see here is the beginning with the Minoan civilization down here, the island of Crete. Volcanic eruption wipes them out. Uh, Tsunami. And then what you need to notice here is the geography of Greece. First of all, it's a peninsula. It's the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And it's very rocky and mountainous. This matters. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But following the fall of the Mycenaean civilization, the Minoan ending, Greece is sort of in a dark period. We call it the Dark Ages, which we'll see more than one Dark Ages in history, until about the year 800 BC. And that's where we see the stories of Homer come along, where he was wanting to provide an inspiration to people in this malaise of the Dark Ages in Greece to inspire them, say, look, this is how we used to be as Greeks. Let's try to return to this. Look at these great heroes. Another video I'm skipping. Watch it on your own. Now, the Phoenicians are somebody that we saw early on, but what's kind of cool is you are directly affected by the Phoenicians because their written alphabet, the Greeks took, the Romans took the Greeks, and that's our alphabet now. What's kind of cool here is you can kind of see, you take this letter, Aleph, and flip it on the side, that's alpha. That's like an upside down B. There's delta. You can recognize an M and N, a backwards K and an L. So we've got some letters here that directly correspond to some of the Greek letters, and then we have them now. So it's kind of cool that we can trace our alphabet back millennia. So this is what Greece looks like around the year 700 BCE. This is where the Greece of your probably prior knowledge comes into play. It's based on city-states. The polis is the city-state. You might notice polis, politics, police, all of that deals with government, governing, and this is the city-state. So the reason I mentioned the geography is you couldn't have a lot of unity because of all the mountainous topography. So that's why you have independent city-states develop, which each have their own way of doing things. They each have their own form of government. They each have their own god or goddess who is important to them. So there's not unity. However, they all consider themselves Greeks. You're familiar with this because we see this every 4 years, the Summer Games. And it started with the original Greeks getting together in their city-states to have like a show of the best, a competition between them, a friendly competition, in a festival honoring Zeus. So we got two main city-states in Greece early on that you need to be familiar with. The first is Sparta. I think everybody knows about Sparta because of the horrible movie by Zack Snyder, The 300. Terrible movie. Only benefit to it is that it actually showed the way the Spartans lived and trained and some of their famous sayings. Otherwise, it's a terrible movie. So Sparta is an oligarchy. An oligarchy is a rule by a few people. The dedication of each Spartan citizen is to be in the military. If you're busy fighting in the military or training for the military, you don't have time to legislate or govern. So Sparta had two kings, kind of co-kings, uh, and then like a council of elders. But really, the oligarchy was a handful of people who made all the decisions that the rest of the city-state had to abide by. Whereas what we see with Athens is they're the birthplace of democracy, coming from the Greek word demos, meaning hand. So democracy is where all of the citizens participate, they write the laws, they govern the city-state. And as a result, everybody who is a citizen in Athens has to be a participant. Now, not everybody is citizens. For instance, women were not citizens. If you didn't own land, you weren't a citizen. If you were a slave, you weren't a citizen. So it was only men who owned land, really, the upper class, that were the citizens. But even still, there were tens of thousands. But they did that so that their city-state was their own. Pericles is a famous statesman, a famous man who made a speech whenever these two were fighting, called the Funeral Oration, where he basically defined Athens. He said, essentially, we are a democracy. Philosophy is a combination of the Greek words philos and sophia, which is the love of wisdom. Philosophy is trying to answer questions about the universe and humanity and all that. Some of the famous philosophers, and this is really Greece is the birthplace of Western philosophy, beginning with Socrates, and you might have heard of the Socratic method, which is teaching by questioning. Socrates would be presented with questions, and he would answer the people by asking them questions so that they arrive at the conclusions themselves. He had a very famous student named Plato, who in turn had a very famous student named Aristotle. These guys are like the trifecta of Western civilization at the beginning, and a lot of science and understanding about the world, religion, a lot of it was based for many, many years following, especially through the Middle Ages, on these philosophers. Aristotle, interestingly enough, was the teacher of somebody famous that we will see shortly. There's a couple of other forms of government that the Greeks developed. One of them is tyranny, which for us nowadays is a bad thing. Tyranny is you have a tyrant who is one person wielding absolute power, like a dictator. For them, tyranny was just a form of government. It wasn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It was one person in charge. Then aristocracy is ruled by the wealthy. So the aristocrats are the landowning wealthy people who make the rules, and everybody else is excluded. So it's Athens was sort of like an aristocracy, but their citizenship requirements were, or their power requirements were, less strict than an aristocracy would have been. So the Persian Wars. This is what that movie, covering the Battle of Thermopylae, was about. The Persian Empire is trying to expand across the Aegean Sea and conquer the Greeks, and the Greeks managed to unite themselves and fight against the invaders. Darius was the first one, the famous one from the movie Xerxes, fighting to keep the Peloponnesian Peninsula under the control of the Greeks. This is where we see a couple of very famous battles. Marathon, yes, that's where the name came from, because it was, guess how far, the Battle of Marathon, which was up here. You can see it's pointing. Marathon is there. Athens is there. Guess how far apart they are? About 26 miles. And a poor guy named Phidippides ran the whole thing, got to town, said, "We won," and then dropped dead, which is why I am never going to run a marathon. History shows that it can be deadly. Thermopylae is the famous one. That means hot gates, where the Persians were brought through to a choke point between basically a cliff wall and the sea. And the 300 Spartans, one of the kings said, "We got to fight," and it was a religious holiday. The Greeks took the religion seriously. It was a religious holiday, so the council of rulers in Sparta said, "No, we're not going to fight." So the king took his personal bodyguards, like his secret service, 300 of them, with him, and they gathered up other Greeks who were willing to fight, and they went to hold off the Persians at the Thermopylae Pass until the religious holiday was over. Of course, we all know they lost. It was a slaughter, but they slaughtered a lot of people on the Persian side too. Salamis is the famous one that another atrocious movie was made about, as far as I know. I never watched it, where the Greeks beat the Persians in the end. So then the Persians have been defeated, and about, you can see from 480, about 50 years later, that unity that brought them together to repel the foreign invaders broke down, and they started fighting themselves. It was a battle between the Delian League, which was Athens and their allies, and Sparta and their allies for control of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. They wanted to fight, which is why it's called the Peloponnesian War. I'm going to skip this video. Watch it on your own. So it was Athens democracy versus Sparta military oligarchy. Sparta won. That's kind of the end of the Greek unity because the Spartans were not governors, which opens the door for the Macedonians up here in the north to invade and take over and begin creating the Macedonian Empire. Philip II is the guy that starts it, but his son is a little bit more famous, perhaps, because he was Alexander the Great, who created a vast empire, which incorporated the Greeks. And this is where we see an end of the Greek autonomy, the independent city-states doing their own thing. Now they're all part of Alexander the Great's empire. He creates what's called the Hellenistic world, because this part of the world is called the Hellespont. And so he spread Greek culture because his teacher was a Greek philosopher. And so he was raised with it. He had his learning. So the Hellenistic world spread Greek culture from the Mediterranean almost up to all the way to India, and brought the learning, the knowledge, and all that stuff from the places that he had conquered back to the Mediterranean world. So it was a really good exchange. Expanded the empire, spread Greek culture, but also enabled trade and the spread of ideas. This is what his empire looks like. We see it goes all the way up to the Indus River Valley. All of the Mediterranean, what we've seen so far, plus Egypt, Alexandria. He liked to name things after himself. There's about a dozen Alexandrias all named after him. I'm going to skip this. It talks about naming his cities. You can do that yourself. Skipping that. And you can do a Persian chart. I'm going to skip ahead of all this so that I can make sure that I get this wrapped up in a timely fashion. Actually, no, I'll make a second video. Keep watching. The religion, I think, is the most familiar one, with the Greek gods that all are various aspects of human strengths and weaknesses. Their social structure, it's pretty standard the way we see in most other places. Intellectual, this is where some people who impact the world even to this day, like Euclid inventing geometry, Pythagorean theorem. Herodotus is called the father of history. He wrote chronicles about historical events. Artistic, the Greeks and then the later Romans were realistic. They wanted to depict the human form in its beauty and in its perfection. They almost worshipped the human body, which is why, you might understand a little deeper, their gods all had human characteristics of one extreme or another. So they had realistic looking mosaics and paintings and sculptures that was lost for many, many years after the fall of the Roman Empire. The methods were lost until the Arabs preserved it and provided it to the Europeans following the Crusades, and that led to the Renaissance, which is the rebirth of Greek and Roman culture. This is just interesting. The classical architecture is, if you think of columns like the Parthenon, has different styles. There's the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, various phases of architectural development. And obviously our nation, not just being a democratic country, being that citizens can vote, but also architecturally, the Supreme Court looks almost just like the Parthenon. They also invented drama. They came up with tragedies and comedies. So if you enjoy one-act play or theater, things like that, it's because of the Greeks. And these famous masks here are because they would wear masks, because sitting in the amphitheater you might not be able to see all the way down to the stage, and so the actors would change masks so people would know what they're feeling. So if they look angry or happy or sad, that way people know. And with part 2, I'm going to pause or stop here, and then I will put part 2 up for Rome, the Roman Republic, shortly following this.